the session devoted to the direct and indirect costs of war. Exactly one of the things that I was talking about at the plenary session. And the examples I was giving, I basically borrowed from the speakers that we have today at this panel. So we have three speakers, each dealing with different, I would rather say, indirect costs of war in absolutely different directions and dimensions. All very interesting, and we also have very interesting geographical combination because we have Georgia, we have Ukraine, and we have ex-Yugoslavia. I think Kara is going to speak maybe more about Bosnia, but I'm not sure. Yeah, so this is a geography we have, and the speakers that we have are Nutsa, Lomsadze, is that correct way to pronounce the name? Urban planner and architect from Georgia, who is going to talk about the IDPs, the internally displaced people after the wars that took place in Abkhazia and Ossetia, living now on territory of Georgia. And we have Sinon Shirochin. I'm not sure about your disciplinary background, but from your works, it looks like it's history of architecture or cultural studies. Anyway, it's the talk is dealing with the architectural and cultural heritage and what's going on with it because of the war, although it's not the direct damage by the war, but absolutely and obviously connected to the war taking place in Ukraine. And a third speaker we have online, Aris Piplas, an architect as well, perhaps also urban planner, I guess, who works everywhere in Europe, because we are talking each time he's located somewhere else, but definitely in Switzerland, also in Italy, and with the background and experience in Yugoslavia. And now also involved in the consulting of Ukrainian government in regard to the restoration and redevelopment of Ukrainian cities after the war. So Harris has a unique perspective that allows him comparing the consequences of Yugoslavian war with the current war in Ukraine. So this is a set of the speakers that we have, and yeah, I think we will have three presentations, one after another, with maybe short clarifying questions after each, and a common discussion at the end. And we have time until till 2, I think. Yeah, so that's our time schedule. And I suggest we start with Nutsa's presentation. It's on a computer? Working table. On the working table. That's it, right?
Yeah, that's
okay, and I think if in Zoom we share a screen, share a screen. This one, right? Harris, can you see it on the screen now?
Yes, it's not
Perfect.
yeah, not full, but quite full.
Arrows.
yeah.
Arrows do not work, but the mouse works.
Should we scroll?
And start clicking, I will connect mouse. It will be easier
Okay.
to display.
Oh no. Where can I find full screen?
Here.
Should be view somewhere. Wait.
Read mode, maybe
Full screen mode.
Mouse button works.
The back button. No, way back. So, hi everyone again. I'm Nutsa, Lomsadze from Symbolic, Georgia, urban planner and architect, and urban researcher, I'd say. So, and today I'm going to talk about more of indirect effects of the conflicts on the urban environment. And we'll discuss two case studies in Georgia because there are two main waves of migration due to the conflicts in Georgia, one of them from 1990s and another one was more recent in 2008. So we're going to talk about the waves of migration from there and the urban environments that hosted them. That's an interesting fact that nowadays, with more than 300,000 IDPs, which makes up 6% of the total population in Georgia, the country stays like in the international rankings on IDPs. It stays in the one of the top places, and the history of the conflict and displacement is built up by a very complex geopolitical situation, as well as ethnic diversity, which is very strong in Georgia. And also, we might say it's also driven by imperial interests. So we will discuss them all. So to have an idea about the geopolitics and geography of Georgia, so you'll know the location between Black Sea and Caspian Sea. Oh, that's okay. So, these two waves of migration coming from Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they are both bordering regions on the northern part of the country, and bordering North Caucasus, more Russian Federation, and they are both consisted from very diverse ethnic groups. And these migrations are strongly connected to the post-Soviet era. So at the end of this 70-year Soviet hegemony, most of the Soviet countries, Soviet republics, started aspiring to independence, and Georgia was one of them. But it also caused many ethnic tensions. So Abkhazia is very strong in ethnic diversity, as I mentioned. So it was one of the cases. And in the beginning of 1990s, in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, several strong separatist movements arose, and it resulted in huge waves of migration. And first, we'll talk about Abkhazia because this conflict started in 1992 because this separatist movement was very strong, and it was backed up by Russian authorities. And in order to protect the territory of the state, Georgian government sent the troops in Abkhazia, and they took the Sukhumi. They went up until Sukhumi, which is the main city of the region. And so the war not to continue in the details, but the war continued more than a year, and actually it's an interesting coincidence that today it marks exactly 31 years when Sukhumi was fell down.
Today.
Yeah, today. So yeah, in 1993, Georgian authorities had to leave the region, leaving the region under the control of Russian Federation and the separatist parties. So, and as a result of the war, about 250,000 ethnic Georgians fled from the region, and they mostly were settled in the adjacent regions of Samegrelo and Imereti. And some of them were hosted by their relatives, but most of them had to address mostly administrative or cultural buildings, which had been abandoned already because when the Soviet Union collapsed and the economy deteriorated, these buildings were dysfunctional and they were abandoned. So most of the IDPs were self-settled in this kind of buildings. Yeah, so like after the tensions of this like conflicts have always been there, but another huge wave arose in 2008 when in the August this time in the South Ossetia, like Georgian. So there was armed conflict developed in the beginning of August, and although it lasted for 5 days, it was very intense and resulted in hundreds of victims from both sides and thousands of displaced people. I want to mention the most significant difference from these two waves of displacement, and it's connected to the governmental policy on internal displacement. So in 2007, the government accepted this state strategy and action law on IDPs. And before that, it was very confusing because the state didn't have a very specific policy, and they didn't know how to address to the IDPs because they were hoping that they would go back soon. So they did not quite have a strategy how they would react in the case. But in 2007, when they accepted this law, it mentioned that it was very important to serve with adequate housing before they were back to their homes, and also create conditions for dignified stay and safe return back. So this was the point when in 2008 war, the government had to act differently, and they would not just let them self-settle in the abandoned buildings. I'll now briefly talk about the two cities which hosted these migration waves. So the migrants from Abkhazia were, as I mentioned, they were hosted also relatives, but they were self-settled in a huge administrative and cultural buildings, and Alt-Uba is the city which is like very rich by this kind of buildings. And I'll quickly mention the context of Alt-Uba, which was a very popular Soviet balneological resort in the western part of Georgia. And it was like from 1930s, there were huge, like imperialistic sanatoriums have been built, and the resort could host 10,000 up to 10,000 patients a day. They would go there to get. So Altova is rich by its radon water, and it's good for some kind of treatments. And it was very popular in the Stalinistic era, especially. And but after 1990s, all these sanatoriums got abandoned. So when these IDPs left Abkhazia, they addressed Altova because it had a huge resource of this habitation. But the sanatoriums were not good for, like, they did not express adequate conditions for living. So these people had to readjust the buildings because, like, in some cases it had like very high ceiling, and they just built the boxes inside to warm it up easily. So the condition and the aesthetics of the sanatoriums have deteriorated significantly, but also the structural conditions were very bad because, like, the water was coming down and etc. But still, these IDPs lived in this kind of conditions for up to 30 years, just before the government decided to relocate them to build a separate housing for them and relocate them. It was also a social aspect and issue because maybe we can discuss this mentality later more, but I'll mention here that so these IDPs were not quite accepted by the local population. They thought of them more as a burden and not as an opportunity or as a diversity or additional skills that they could bring in the city. Because the locals thought that like after the country would stand up on the feet again, the sanatoriums would function to their first purpose again. But as the IDPs were living in it, the local population blamed that the city did not develop as it could. So in 2019, the government started to build these several housing units, but the thing is that it's detached from the city center. It's in a very remote place, and up to 10 buildings have been built, but until the end of 2021, all the families were relocated, but it was not that straightforward because also there was a great issue that several IDPs mentioned that so the state would send the inspections. They would go to the sanatoriums to list who was living in there. In fact, like, because some of them would go to their relatives and stay there, and they would not give the housing units if they were not living in the sanatoriums. So yeah, that's quite harsh. And recently, I'll quickly mention about the master plan. Recently, the government decided that they can bring new life to Altova with the old functions to restore the sanatoriums. But they needed to like brand it or package it somehow so it would be more acceptable for the investments. And they decided to announce the competition of the master plan, and that's how I'm related to Altova. That our office worked on the master plan of Altova, and after that, the purpose was that when the IDPs would be relocated to the different area, they could sell these sanatoriums to the investors. But it didn't go as well as they expected, and not much interest has been paid. Like 2 or 3 sanatoriums are already sold, but there are over 22 sanatoriums in total. So most of them are still abandoned and in a very bad condition. And an interesting fact was that the leader of the current political party, Georgian Bizina Ivanishvili, if you've heard of him. So he promised people that if no one would show up to invest in the sanatoriums, he would buy all of them and restore them in the first purpose. So that was quite heroic from him. But still, like a lot of sanatoriums remain in like abandoned and everything. So, but still no action from him. We'll see what happens. I'll move to another urban structure that I want to discuss in terms of migration from 2008 war. It's the city of Gori in the central part of Georgia. It's about 8 kilometers from Tbilisi, the capital. And it was greatly affected also by the war. It has been bombed, and it has also IDPs itself, but they were they could return to their city afterwards. But Gori, I want to discuss Gori as a host city for the IDPs because it has 2 structures of IDP settlements. First to discuss is the location of them, because they have been planned to be settled in the very remote parts of the city. So it's like spatially, it would be very detached from the city. Here, this is an interesting image. So it's a historical city with a castle in the center, but it's interesting because here you can see the IDP settlement. So it's quite detached from the city center. But also, it's interesting that the city itself, it's a very small city, like up to 50,000 inhabitants, and the economy of the city and the resources are not that strong to have assisted new inhabitants. And this IDPs mentioned this issue a lot in the interviews. But also there are very diverse opinions inside the settlement as well, because like a lot of them are of course integrated with the city and they are commuting, but also a lot of them are commuting to the capital because it's very close, in 8 kilometers. So it's the everyday economy for the settlement, but a lot of them mentioned that they enjoyed living in this area for one reason, that it's in the more like green area, because these people, IDPs, are from the villages. They come from the villages, and their natural like traditional activities to, I don't know, have a land and harvest and stuff. And although they don't have much, like there's a land shortage in the settlements, they still have this small gardens in front of their houses, and they are still enjoying the place. And they also mentioned that it's it's better for them to live there because they are under the same destiny as they said, and they prefer to live with people with same conditions than to integrate with others, because they would understand each other more easily. And that's also a very interesting mental state. But it's interesting that like I'll briefly mention about the planning and architecture of the settlement. So it was planned. This specific settlement is considered as a different case rather than other settlements. So there are 33 this kind of settlements in Shita-Kartli region, which was most affected by the war. But this specific settlement was planned and financed by GIZ, and they not only planning, but they had this like huge program that even after finalizing the construction, they had some programs that would support the IDPs living there. And but it was interesting that about choosing the location, they mentioned that there used to be a cemetery of German troops of World War II somewhere in the nearby, so that's why they chose this location. And there's also like the main street in the settlement is called Berliner Allee. So it's very much connected to German context. And I wanted to say. So yeah, and the programs that they had was also to support IDPs in terms of when they were constructing the houses, they involved the IDPs and they trained them so they could like build up the skills to use them afterwards and to be able to I don't know, to use their skills in the future to help their families. And so the settlement didn't have, when they planned it, it didn't have any much public services like school or kindergarten. And they mentioned that they did it on purpose because the integration process would be easier if they would go to the city and interact with local children. But afterwards, as I mentioned, some resources are not sufficient from the city, so it doesn't provide much for the settlement. And this kind of problem was concerned also about the kindergarten, and because there was no place in the adjacent areas in the kindergartens, they built one in the settlement later. And yeah, so for the terms of integration, it was very hard because, but I would say maybe more for the adults because they stayed in and they didn't interact much. But for the children, it was a natural process that they got interacted and integrated in the city because they made friends in the school or kindergarten. And also, I lost my. No, that's okay. But also, it's interesting that 16 years have passed already. So most of the kids don't even know what their homeland was, and like for them, this is their homeland now. So that's very natural. And I wanted to conclude with this very shameful fact that I was just coming here yesterday and the internet, like the social media was full of this news. So yesterday, so there are elections coming up in Georgia in like 3 weeks. And the ruling party is very much concentrated on this topic of war, and sovereignty is their top headline of their campaign. And yesterday they set up a lot of huge billboards around the city threatening the population that this might happen if they don't choose them. So they are manipulating on the war and peace, and this what it says is no to war and choose peace. So, and they use the images from what's going on in Ukraine, and it's, I don't know, it's very shameful. And I just wanted to mention that this fact, and it's also a proof that like this topic of peace is always on the agenda, like how many years have passed, but it's still very current and very, very moving for most of the population. So a lot of them will vote for them because of this, and that's on this happy.
Happy end.
On this happy.
Thank you. Wanted to ask how many people are settled in this settlement in Gori?
There are 300 families.
300 families, so about 1,000. And why Gori was chosen? Is it known? Was it discussed?
Actually, it was like most of these settlements are built on along the highway. It's also kind of a political statement that they chose also because it's like visible from, like, it's the most active axis of the country, and they would be visible when it's kind of a statement that we have, like, these IDPs are so exposed, but also because they would be close to their places of displacement. I'm not quite sure what's the idea in that, because actually some in Gorid, in that settlement, there was a guy who mentioned that he could see his village and house from his
From Gori, he can see a city.
Yeah, but that's also like mentally very challenging and hard to see it all the time, but not to be able to get there. But on the, I don't know, better side is that although the border is closed, like sometimes they allow to for some people to cross the border, go to their cemeteries, or like for example on the Easter we have a tradition that we would go to the cemetery. So sometimes they allow it, so they would be close to the villages. That was also there.
Thank you. Well, maybe time for one question we still have. If not, yeah, okay.
I'm wondering, you mentioned German troops.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this German context. Why is it there and why is it connected? I'm not getting that.
So we had, like, there were, as I know, there were some hostages from World War II, German hostages. Prisoners of war, yeah. And they were, like, some of them happened to be in Gori, and as I know, like, there's also a stadium which was built by them, right? In Gori, there is this football stadium which was built by German prisoners, and so, like, when they died, they had local cemetery appearance.
But is it?
It's like no land,
Yeah,
without
No,
meaning.
no.
Yeah, it's just abandoned.
Yeah, I don't think there's even some stones or writings or anything. It's just this verbal.
abandoned.
Yeah.
So they kept the memory with the
Yeah.
Berliner Allee.
Yeah.
Ironic. Okay, thank you very much. Let's move further. Thank you. Yeah, that was an example of these indirect costs of war, quite direct, basically, of the war, and still lasting for decades and decades, by the way. Yeah, and with this political manipulation, maybe lasting for many other decades. Simeon, would you take the floor, and we'll try to find your presentation.
As you wish.
Yeah, you send it. Mm-hmm.
You got it? We started late, no problem. You can start speaking, I'll find it.
Okay, while my presentation is being searched here, I would like to say a few words about what I'm going to talk about. As I research historic architecture and I'm focused on socialist period, I tried to analyze everything from the point of view of heritage protection, because I'm trying to find the information to talk about the value. And the problem is that most of Ukrainian heritage is unprotected. Only a few percent have official protection status and are protected by law. But most of the heritage isn't official. And this is not because it's not valuable. It is because it's not yet researched. And the problem of war is that heritage is being destroyed without recognition. It's been destroyed before we knew and we spoke about its value. And the problem is that very few people understand this. And there is a stereotype that there is nothing valuable from socialist period, there's nothing valuable in industrial cities, but there is, or there was, because a lot of heritage has been lost without recognition. And that's why I will try to speak heritage centralized. And I need the information how to switch between slides. Okay,
Just scroll.
Okay, so as you see the title slide, maybe you would expect to see something more related with war, but the thing is that this image is related with war. This is what is happening now. This picture is from July. So there is the fact that war losses, the losses that happened during the war, are done not only by bombs, missiles, drones, they are done also by bulldozers. So it looks like this is not enough how much we have lost. Looks like we need to lose some more. And this is the problem, because I understand how much is lost, and for me it looks absolutely unacceptable that something is being destroyed by bulldozers at the same time. That's why I put this image as the title one. Okay, so let's okay, so the war damage. Of course, the main damage now is war damage. There is no exact number of how much is lost. But I think that the highest number of losses was 200,000 buildings all around Ukraine. Just imagine this number, 200,000 buildings of all types. Of course, some of them were valuable, not all of them were valuable. Sometimes the whole cities were ruined. And I'm not very optimistic about rebuilding them. I agree with Oleg that the industrial cities especially, they were created and they were founded for the people that would work on some specific mines, factories that were mostly created in the end of 19th and the beginning of 20th century and in Soviet times as well. So the problem is that now there are no people there, now there are no houses there, and now the industry is gone. So the industry that was the reason why the cities were built is gone. And I don't really believe that those cities will be rebuilt because there are questions for whom? Who will live there? If there is no job, there is no industry. And even the industry that survived the economic crisis in the 1990s was destroyed during the war because each factory becomes a fortress. That's why the factories that were created, that were built for many years, they are now lost, they are now destroyed. And there is a question of the future of these territories. So also, we lose many valuable architectural monuments, and that many of the lost objects of heritage were not researched, and we really didn't know about them. Of course, a few people did, but there is, as I've said, there is a stereotype that there's nothing valuable there because people usually, the problem is that people don't know their heritage, because their heritage is not only an object. Heritage is as it was said in one book, it's a process of meaning making. What does it symbolize for you? So the problem is that people can look at the same building, but they can see different things. So some people see buildings, some for panel building. They see, oh, this is something Soviet. When I see the technology. When I see some older building, I see the work of engineers, architects, and I understand that this is valuable. But some people can see only something that is associated with their stereotypes. And the problem is that the rethinking of heritage hasn't happened before this war. And that's why a lot of heritage is out of focus. And what happens is that the fate of ruins is unclear. And it's a very important thing, because if the valuable building is ruined, for example, you all remember what happened when the Notre Dame de Paris was burned. Everybody, there was no question about should we rebuild. Of course, it should be restored. They even took some very old trees to make the same roof and so on. So when something valuable and well known is destroyed or damaged, everybody is agreed that we need to do it, we need to restore it. But when something that you didn't know about it, but valuable, but interesting and unique is lost, you don't care. This is how it works, unfortunately. So what do we have? So this is the example of the city of Marinka that was, it's an example how city can be completely destroyed. I don't see on this photo a single building that wasn't damaged. See that most buildings are damaged, some of them are completely ruined, and this is one of the questions, the fate of these cities, because they're too damaged, and mostly people have left this place. So there's question for whom to rebuild it and why to rebuild it. And for what reason to rebuild it? Because the industry is also lost. And that's why there's a great depopulation of this territory. And that's why I really don't believe when some optimistic people say that we will rebuild everything and it will be better than it was before. I would say that it's like they're not sincere or they're not competent. Say about it. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so there are examples of buildings that have been damaged several times. Sometimes I find pictures of buildings that were damaged during the Second World War. And this is the same building. I think, yes, so 1945 and 2023, it's Bakhmut. For Maratyomov, it's one of the cities where there was a big battle. And this city was very old. It had many valuable buildings from different periods, from period of Russian Empire, because it was a trade center. And there were rich merchants living there in times of their architecture from late 19th century and other architecture from Soviet times. But this is the same building built in 1930s. And I see that in 2023, it's more damaged than it was during the Second World War, because you see that the left part of the building is totally ruined now. And this is just an example. There are a lot of buildings in the city that have this condition. And the question is if they will be rebuilt. Because after the Second World War, there was another approach, another economy, and those buildings were valued as square meters, as some material, because you didn't have enough brick to build it from the beginning. So a lot of buildings that were damaged were rebuilt, though many didn't survive the Second World War. So now the city is being destroyed for the second time, and its fate is unclear. And also, maybe we have some examples. So one of the most sadly famous buildings that were destroyed during the Russia-Ukraine war is the Mariupol Drama Theater. I visited this building about a year before the war and understood that it's one of the main buildings of the city. It's located in the center of the central square, and it's on the central axis of Central Avenue. So this is not a governmental building, but a public building that was in the center of the city. And this building was an architectural monument twice. First, because of its architectural value, and the second status was given to the statues, say. There were two tables, say. And when you see this as the picture when it was bombed, so most of the building was destroyed, a lot of people were killed, we don't know the number. Then the occupational administration said that they will rebuild it. And as they have control over the territory, they started doing this. But it looks like the people that do this rebuilding are not enough competent to do this, because in 2024, they got those statues being destroyed just because the roof fell on them. So they even didn't think about this. So it happened that in 2022, the first object of protection was destroyed, and in 2024, the second. And this is one of the topics that was partly discussed already today, the fate of the cities on the occupied territories. And on the one hand, occupational administration says that we will rebuild it, it will be better than it was. On the second side, we see that this is done absolutely unprofessionally sometimes. And that, of course, they try to make a good image, though most of the city remains in very bad condition, because I think that most of the buildings there were damaged or destroyed. And sometimes I find the news that the buildings that were in good condition are demolished. And I cannot understand this. But for some reason, maybe for financial reason, they earn more money on constructing new buildings than on restoring old ones. And this is the same problem that happens on both sides. Because in Ukraine, similar process happened because it's a question of money. And when we speak about heritage, we also speak about some objects that are very young and that are not yet recognized as a heritage. For example, the bus station, Dnipro city in Ukraine, was built in 1993. This is an example of late modernism. It didn't have any protection status because it was young, but it was an example of the design, the style that is not used anymore. And this was the biggest bus station in Ukraine. It had 2 levels. It was very interesting, but it was ruined by the missile attack. And as it doesn't have any protection status, it's not likely that this building will be rebuilt as it was before. Maybe they will decide that it is cheaper to build something new instead. And that's why a lot of unrecognized objects get lost. And the next very important topic is the politicization of heritage, because the war happens not only about territory, it happens about the symbolic space. And this is one of the topics that we discussed here. So the problem is that now they try to change. So they don't try to rethink the value, but they try to exclude the objects that are related to communist era or to Russian history or culture. So it happens that instead of reappropriating the heritage, Ukrainian current propaganda follows Russian propaganda and agrees that the heritage from Soviet Union and Russian Empire is more related to Soviet Union or Russian Empire than to Ukraine, where it is located. And this is the problem, that the rage against occupants is being directed to the heritage of Ukraine, but this heritage is not rethought as the part of Ukrainian culture, though it was done by Ukrainian architects, engineers, sculptures, and so on. And a lot of heritage is also being destroyed because of this. And the vandalism that happens against monumental art, sculptures, is never punished. And the problem is that alternative opinion about this is not welcomed. If you say that this is valuable, let's keep it, let's protect it, you will hear that you are the agent of Kremlin and something like this. So this is a great problem. And I see that many people that want to keep this, to protect the heritage, they cannot do anything. It's a great problem. So some examples. The example, this building is not destroyed, but the thing is that there was a very interesting precedent. It was before the war, a few years before the war. This is the building, the residential house in Kyiv. It was built in 1934 for the collective farming ministry. And later, the documentation was prepared for it to be enlisted as cultural heritage, but there was an opinion said publicly that we cannot protect this because this is the heritage of the totalitarian regime. So it belongs to the collective farming ministry, Ministry of Totalitarian Government, so it's part of totalitarian regime, not us. Then this opinion was didn't impact the result. So the building got the protection. But when I heard about this case, I understood that in future, there will be cases when something doesn't get protection because of political reasons, of seeing some symbols in the material object that is valuable for its as a work of art. But it happens that for some people, it's a political symbol. And I understood that architecture will suffer from this. And I will show you the case a little later. So, what happens when the war began? We have a mass destruction of Second World War memorials. And though there is a law that is protecting the graves and memorials related to Second World War, now there are regions that boast how much they have destroyed. So the problem is that this is against the law, but nobody cares. This looks like mass vandalism, but nobody cares. So works that were done by sculptures that represent human talent are now destroyed. So they're not removed, they're destroyed as symbols, and nobody cares. In some regions, now even boast that they have destroyed all the memorials on their territory. So we understand that this actually is not only work of art, it's also sometimes they're the graves of people who died, and they're dedicated also to the victims of war. And sometimes they don't have any symbols of Soviet government. Sometimes they're abstract modernist sculptures, but they're anyway destroyed. And this is a great problem that is absolutely ignored now because of war. And about the symbols, sometimes things like this happen. There was some monument on the entrance, the welcome monument on the entrance of some town. There were two women, and then somebody said that one of those women is Russian, and they destroyed it. Later, somebody said that actually the dress represents some of other Ukrainian regions. It is traditional for that place, but it was too late. So it's a fight on the symbolic level. So you see something that looks Russian, you destroy it. And this, I don't know how much objects were destroyed like this, but this is one of the cases where nobody is trying to see the artistic value. Nobody is trying to understand that this is a work of art, that somebody worked on this, and maybe this author lived in the same city with you. And maybe he's your neighbor, maybe you know his children, but because the heritage is not researched, it's not recognized, things like this can happen. And unfortunately, there are many cases like this. So let's continue about the construction business. Developers are getting benefits from war. How do they do it? Because ruined buildings is a free space for construction. That's why they are not interested in restoring damaged buildings. That's why there are fake conclusions about the impossibility of restoration. Society is focused on war and survival, so activists are busy with some other things. They're volunteering, some of them are in the army. So the public attention is not focused on heritage protection. And it happens that the hatred is directed against the heritage and against the activists that try to keep the heritage. Also, we have the simplification of construction legislation. So there are less regulations that were before. And there is a new law. I think it's not yet signed, but it makes a change and to the interest of developers. And the interesting fact, the sad but interesting fact, is that the most heritage losses in Kyiv are because of the construction business. So the first loss was on the second day of the full-scale invasion. So when everybody was thinking about how do we live, how to survive, what to do, how to protect the city, developers started demolition of historical buildings on the second day of full-scale invasion. And then they saw that it works. It works. This is the building that was damaged by the drone. It was the first historical building damaged by a drone. There were victims. This is built from 1901, I think. It's a historical building, but it didn't have official status. Not because it's not available, but because it's not yet researched. And later, on the same day, they had a conclusion that it cannot be rebuilt. The conclusion was done by people that even didn't visit the place. I made a petition to support restoration of this building. It was signed by 6,000 people in 1 week. That means that there is a social request to restoration of damaged historical buildings. Then they invited me to the city council, and I got no votes, 0 votes to support the petition from the city administration, because the decision was already made in the beginning, because the city administration serves the interest of developers, not the inhabitants. And that's why this building is still standing as a ruin. though it could be already restored if this process was started. There were even volunteer architects from Poland that offered their help to make the project of the building and to rebuild the broken part. But the interest of city administration is not the preservation of cultural heritage. They are part of the construction business.
To build something like that.
Yes, they want to build something like that, I think, because this is how they do all the time. And this is the unique case that happened this year. There was Professor Malinin in the end of 19th century. He built the house, and it was 1890. He built the house for himself, and it happened that this house survived Second World War, it survived reconstructions, it survived when in Soviet times many new buildings were built on the place. Old ones. So it happened somehow that this building was the oldest building on the street. And since 2017, developers wanted to demolish it for new construction, I think 10 or 11 floors high. And since 2017, protection activists tried to save this building. So multiple times, they tried to prepare the justification of the value of this building. And for many times they were refused. And in 2024, developers used the new tactics. The commission that was given or was deciding the fate of the application for status said that this building cannot be a historical monument because the professor who built it had wrong political views, essentially, because they told that he's believed to be a supporter of Russian Empire, but I guess that many buildings were built by people who had some political views that can look wrong now. I think that Egyptian pyramids were built by pharaohs, and we do not like their political views, I think, but they should not characterize the pyramids. But the problem was that the building didn't get protection status. Some people tried to make another documentation, but on the next day when they prepared it, and it was not yet analyzed by the commission, the building was ruined, and it was done on the birthday of our mayor. So it was a birthday present for him from developers. So the problem is that this is the first case when building could achieve protection, but it was refused because of some reasons not related to the value of the building. I'm mostly finished. So the conclusions, the last slide. So many valuable buildings and even whole cities turn into ruins. And the problem of heritage, most heritage is not protected, and the damaged buildings would not be restored. The social hatred is directed against Ukrainian heritage because people don't know why is it valuable, and they think of it as some symbolic objects that are related more with Russia than with Ukraine. And the problem is that this vandalism is never punished, and that the developers are getting benefits from the war, and officials represent their interest. So I'm also not optimistic in the end, but I want to thank you for listening. I hope you have some new information that will be useful for you, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. So thank you.
I think with the last examples, it's obvious that exactly the same thing are going on on the other side of the war, Russia. The same day the war started, developers started destroying historical buildings in my town, in St. Petersburg, and it's lasting. They didn't use, though, I think, the argumentation you mentioned at the end, and I hope nobody will deliver that information on the other side of the border, because we know
They're learning from
they
each
learn
other.
from. One short clarifying question, maybe.
I'm just curious, like, how this development business is unfolding in the midst of the war, and what are their limitations, so to say? Because I mean, I understand that they want to clear them out, but how does it happen that big construction projects, do they take place while drones are flying around?
When the war started, construction sites were frozen, I think, for maybe a few months. But then when they understood that it's not likely that the capital will be taken, they unfroze all the construction sites. But demolition happened even when the Russian army was near. So it looks like they had plans, and also, in my opinion, they were ready to work even if the city is occupied by Russia. They understood that it will be easy for them to continue their activity in the same way because the rules look like the same. And now, as there are a lot of talks of rebuilding Ukraine, they use this idea that sounds very positive, but in their understanding, they are interested in earning money on this rebuilding. And the more they will, the more objects there will be built from the beginning, the more money they will earn. That's why they have a clear interest of not rebuilding damaged buildings. And there were many cases in different cities where public officials told that this building will not be rebuilt. And after that, they were told that this is a monument, just to say. And after that, they said, okay, we will rebuild, but this will be some trade center, not a concert hall, or so they change the type of building. So business would have interest in this reconstruction. But anyway, it looks like all the administrations are focused on the interest of business, not of inhabitants, their opinion, or cultural heritage protection.
Yeah, quite obvious. I mean, my the leftist part of my brain and conscious now is again identifying the sign of the global capitalism, obviously profiting from this kind of shit. Unfortunately,
the global aspect. Is it only Ukrainian investors who are interested in rebuilding, or there's also North European?
I didn't know all the details to be 100% sure, but I understand that the government is interested in inviting also foreign investors to do this. So that's why they're simplifying their regulations to make more investment. But as those regulations change the rules, and it becomes easier to demolish existing buildings, and that's a great fear for me as a person that sees the value of old architecture, that foreign investors would give money for demolition of heritage.
yeah, they see it different. But yes, I think we would like to listen to the stories from another part of Europe, which I'm afraid would sound quite similar, but I don't know. Iris, floor is yours, and tell us what you know.
It's unfortunately very similar what I heard, and I really enjoyed, or of course, also felt together with the colleagues who presented the projects and the activities in Georgia and Ukraine. Happy to share some of my insights, and very glad to continue the discussion. Do you see the full screen now?
Yes, we do.
And you hear me well. So I see we're a bit advanced with time, but I think we would need way more time to dive deep into some of these aspects. I'll try to be as short as possible. I'll try to also to speak a bit faster, jump through some content, and if there's some interest, we can deep dive more in the question and answers, and also feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn or other platforms if there's some more questions. Oleg, thank you a lot to you and your team for the invite, for the great work on gathering us. And again, I hear you see my title that's more oriented towards asking questions rather than giving these absolute answers, because I think there's as pathetic as it sounds, there's no a right or wrong answer in this complex endeavor of how to do it in an integrated, innovative, how international, local it should be. I'm glad to provide the insight from my different hats as a citizen activist, as a UN Habitat consultant, as a practitioner with Dresden Sommer Integrated Urban Solutions, also as a applied researcher at the ETH Zurich. And you will probably feel some of these different hats on during the presentation. I could not help myself not to share a few images from Berlin, a city where you are sitting, city that I grew up in as a refugee of the Yugoslav wars, particularly the siege of Sarajevo. I think we sometimes forget about the historical lessons, and Berlin went through some of these phenomena that were just explained by the colleagues in a very similar way. So I just use a few images for introduction to get us warm. And of course, we all know these dramatic images of the war division, the physical separation, etc., that separated only not the urban tissue, the buildings, but of course families and political blocks. Interestingly, of course, many of you know just the view from another side. That's the Leipzig and Potsdamer Platz. You see, I mean, of course, the reconstruction of the old urban fabric. Even though we all know you'll walk past by, but it's quite astonishing to see what happened in Berlin in the last 20, 30 years. And if we look into the destruction, and I'm not comparing the different modalities of war between these countries, but as an urbanist and architect speaking, there's an incredible amount of buildings demolished through war and planning as well, and post-war planning from here 1940 to 2001. All the buildings in blue are basically partly or entirely new, and you see here the total buildings and interventions. Again, an image I think that many of you already saw. But how to work in this city and how to work in these different political and post-transitional realities in Berlin, it's of course a question, and that's why I think finishing with Berlin, if you look into the Urban Age project books, you see that the urban morphology of Berlin looks a bit different than the one in New York City or in Istanbul, of course, because of the different textures, typologies, hierarchies, destruction. You can really read the traces and process of discontinuity that Berlin went through in terms of open space typologies as well, not only public buildings and of course different scales. I think it's very important. And talking about international activities, I know there are a few international attempts in Ukraine that I will talk about later, but of course, Berlin was based, and that's for maybe the audience who is not very familiar. Of course, you had these competing modernist projects in East Berlin, in the back so-called Stalin Allee, today Karl Marx Allee, and of course also in this I would say remnants of the destroyed city in Berlin. You have of course the modernist Western model. The International Building Exhibition in 1957, the IBA, the Interbau, with Walter Gropius, Alvar Aalto, Oskar Niemeyer, etc. So you have the big modernists coming back to Berlin, many of them already being present in the city before the war. And I felt this was an interesting thing to be remembered. And also what Semyon, you mentioned in your presentation, the Berlin castle that has been rebuilt has not been entirely destroyed in the war, but removed by dynamite, basically in 1950. So you still have this sort of purposeful destruction of architectural heritage in this sense, partly because reminding at this particular moment at Prussian militarism, etc., it needed to be removed. And of course, we have the Palast der Republik that, again, I think it's a unique situation that you have these different sort of building typologies being destroyed and even coming back in the last 50 years. But for me, the question also in my practice is how to deal with the modernist city that has been built on the remnant of destroyed Berlin. And in this sense, still working in for example, that's in Lichtenberg, one of the case studies that we work with some of the Berlin housing authorities is, how to really, even this sort of romantic, socialist, modernist, particular urban tissue that you see here, but if you really zoom in, and that's the images I took while walking through, you still see this discontinuity in the urban tissue. And maybe it's another occasion where I can talk more, but now we are really looking into this forgotten scale of the neighborhood that's not really being treated even properly. It's in German planning law and in many countries, the basic human cell of life, the neighborhood. And it's not the Flächennutzungsplan, it's not the Bebauungsplan, it's this holistic understanding of the neighborhood, the mobility, the social infrastructure, education, commerce, etc. As we needed to invent a new planning instrument, the Quartiers concept, in order to be working in these neighborhoods in a more holistic way and really trying to overlap the synergies between these different layers, public space, social infrastructure, urban form, mobility. And then now you have these sort of popular urban theories and metaphors of the 10-15-minute city, but it's interesting. Our task was here to create a 15-minute city out of this very particular socialist modernist urban tissue, and it was quite a challenge. And this idea that has been developed at I'd say the regreening of the Champs-Élysées now being translated to Lichtenberg was quite a challenge, but quite an inspiring project. I needed to talk about Berlin briefly, but what I promised is Yugoslavia, is Bosnia, Sarajevo. I'm not going into the details of the history because it's too complex, But it's just to be remembered that Bosnia, particularly Sarajevo, is in this in-between zone since the collapse of the division of the Roman Empire, the division of the Church, the border between the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires and the Venetians. So it has been in between, and that was a chance for the government of Marshal Tito after the war to really catalyze the industrialization and urbanization of the country through the Petolietke, through these programs. But then after Tito's conflict with Stalin in 48, Yugoslavia searched for a third way, forming the non-aligned movement. And it was very interesting to see this sort of floating between, let's say, Eastern and Western modernism. So Berlin, you had it separated physically. In Yugoslavia, they were sort of be more fluid. But again, on the remnants of, and that was also interesting what Semyon you mentioned. So what is our heritage? If you look into Sarajevo, you have the Ottoman period, you have the Austro-Hungarian perimeter blocks of the late 19th century, of course, the Ottoman Islamic city with an extrovert spiritual orientation, the socialist city. So what is our city? So what is the Bosnian or Sarajevo architecture? If we look into history, you have all these sort of different local versions of global architectures and global geopolitical influences. And in this sense, this was, of course, again, and this image shows maybe why, as Yugoslavia floating, and this is the image of the opening the Winter Olympics in 1984 in Sarajevo, where it's alphabetically ordered here, but Yugoslavia was literally in between these two mighty blocks, and Sarajevo was also offered to be hosting the Olympic Games because, as we know, the US Americans boycotted the Olympics in 1980 in Moscow, the Summer Olympics, and the same happened the other way around in LA in 84. So Sarajevo became this sort of neutral zone to host also international meetings and events, and this also catalyzed its urban development. That was, of course, based on the modernist dream, and this I could show you many images, but that's one particular. The building you see in the back, it's its construction started. That's the main train station, Hauptbahnhof, in 1947, built again also by German war prisoners. But then, interestingly enough, after the 1948, the conflict between Tito and Stalin, the design done by Czech military engineers was asked to be altered in terms of looking more like Western modernism. So the existing building needed to be sort of de-Stalinized and removed by any socialist realist, also decorative element, in order to adapt to this new sort of geopolitical way of Yugoslavia. And of course, Marshal Tito, of course, looking into culture, architecture, urbanism as one of the instruments to build a new society on top of this colonial, or what we're going to call it, heritage, and in this sense, introducing new also construction processes, prefabrication standards, etc., etc. But 1992, this modernist utopia became the dystopia, and in this sense, this part of the city, because of its open spaces and corridors, became the most dangerous area because of the sniper shooters and because of being exposed to shelter. So in this sense, the population partly left the modernist city and went back to this more introvert Austro-Hungarian perimeter block or the Ottoman city part. So in this sense, here you see how the kind of the modernist dream ended up in 1995, and what sort of our generation was faced with. And interestingly enough, but also looking not only at this dramatic and images, what's also interesting that the forgotten ecosystems and ecologies of this, I'd say the pre-modernist city were rediscovered in order as a survival method for discovering water water streams that have been uncovered by infrastructure planning in 1950s and 60s, reusing public space not for this romantic, social aspects of urban agriculture, but for survival. So interestingly enough, how the whole, I'd say, modernist dream was, I would say, de-urbanized in a way, or ruralized, and how the forbidden practices, because during socialism, urban agriculture was forbidden and was of course, only allowed to be done in agricultural areas outside the city, moved in back to the city in these dramatic moments. I mean, we know similar images from Havana, etc., after the crisis in 1990. So just wanted to, but then what was also relevant at Sarajevo, just similar to when Ukrainian cities became this sort of object of global solidarity. So you have philosophers and movie stars and Formula One drivers and Lady Diana and the Pope coming to Sarajevo, architects, Lebbeus Woods from New York, working on these visions for the reconstruction of the city. But many of these beautiful designs and books that have been printed later in New York, they never really reached the ground. It was never really constructed. So in this sense, question of my generation was, despite this global solidarity, funding, UN Habitat, MIT, all these players who were in this small city of 400,000 people, how come that the reconstruction mostly failed and that it was basically sort of restored maybe to the old one and with new commercial business models that I will talk about in a moment. So this building you just saw is here on the right. That's 1996, that's 2011, and how the city was objected to I would say not sustainable and not inclusive regeneration reconstruction. And I have to show you these few images. So those are the presidents of Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia signing the peace agreement. You see the German chancellor, the French president, Bill Clinton, Joy Major, the UK representative, Russia behind. And it was very interesting to see how some of these protagonists ended up. So there's a statue for commemorating or celebrating Bill Clinton. This is in Pristina in Kosovo. And how, interestingly enough, these protagonists, so Milosevic, the Serbian president, that's the gentleman in the suit. This is an image from the prison in Scheveningen, close to Den Haag. So you see here the different Croatian, Serbian, and Bosnian, I'd say, war generals who have been put to the same prison and celebrating birthday parties together 15 years, 20 years after the war. So, looking at these images of them hanging out together, many of these, I'd say, noble reasons for fighting for your country, etc., became kind of irrelevant. Looking at this sort of a surreal image of these different, I'd say, different parties hanging out together in private space in the same prison. But I count to my own agency, if you allow me. So one day the war is finished, so the front line becomes a normal part of the city. And what happens, and I can talk about it only in a separate lecture, that this architecture provocation, as Latour calls it, and architect, etc., or became something that happened in the different sides of the front line. So the former front line became the new administrative border, East Sarajevo, Serb dominant, Croatian, Bosnian dominant Sarajevo city on the left-hand side, and you see these new investment pathways that have been emerging. Is it more religious building representing the new identity or the rediscovered old identities? Or is it, and that's similar what was mentioned in the lecture before, these urban visions, the modernist city has been replaced by these, it's called je vodič za investiciona ulaganja, guideline for investment for foreign investors, and this sort of became the ruling mechanism of the post-war urban development, is sort of offering the different buildings, offering the spaces for different investors who range from Iran, from Russia, from the US, from Saudi Arabia, from Western Europe. And you could see this on these new buildings. You can see one shopping mall with a Texas flag, another building with a Saudi flag, a third cultural building with the Iranian flag, fourth one with a big EU flag. So you see this sort of geopolitics that Yugoslavia sort of emitted out also during the non-aligned movement, came back in and physically manifested in the city. And you see here this attempt of myself and many of my colleagues to really think, okay, we don't need to build a new city. We need to reactivate especially the human and social spatial potential. And this research activist design project we called Reactivate Sarajevo, gathering the communities, gathering artists, reactivating these forgotten modernist buildings that have been left for decay and for further, I'd say, for demolition and some commercial development. So it was as a multi-stakeholder attempt to really work on the future city and really try to, if not repair the mistakes of the reconstruction, but to do it in a different way, and in particular, going back to these painful locations in the city. So of course, this is the front line, how it looked like. That's after the war. And then how to work with these also traumatic landscapes and how to transform former no-go zones, no man's land, into areas for recovery, areas of public space, areas of recreation, and how to invite citizens to be curators of their own space, even though they have a certain, I'd say, as a mental barrier to go back to this former landmine and former enemy lands. But in this sense, I think this was very important. One of the project images that of the master plans that we did to revitalize and reactivate different parts of the city, and really say that we can somehow work even with this difficult heritage and include it and not remove it. And in this sense, you can see it online. It received some also international visibility at the Venice Biennale of Architecture, but was very important. Received some, I'd say, policy, design, institutional cooperation in Sarajevo itself, and it's a still ongoing project. And finally, I know I'm a bit over time, but if you allow me for 2 more minutes, I just have to make this cross connection to Ukraine. I have been asked many times why, and you can see, scan the QR code of the read interview. Why does the post-war Western Sarajevo failed? What can Ukraine learn from it and other countries? Also a bit aligning with my old network. I have been engaged in Kiev for more than 10 years. Started as a lecturer and advisor to the Connection School of Urban Studies. And this was sort of my platform of continuous engagement in Ukraine since 2014 and before. And what was very important, what happened, and many of you from Ukraine know it much better than me, the law 5655, the pressure that the architectural community receives also from different protagonists from the public and the private sector in this sense. And this was a bit, my current agency is as an advisor, as part of the reconstruction and advisory board as part of the National Union of Ukraine, and now really looking and learning from Sarajevo, learning from Berlin, learning from these different places, and really looking into urban recovery in a more inclusive, and if you want to say, I still say the magic word, sustainable way in understanding scenario building and implementation. And of course, it's incredibly difficult, but we need to activate a whole range of students, activists, colleagues, institutions, and of course as well, and I didn't say that before in Sarajevo, we can't exclude the private sector. So they are important players, but they're still, we have to find ways how this can become symbiotic and synergetic, because it would be dangerous that we close ourselves in the, I'd say safe academic or non-profit space and talk about a future city without the public sector, without the private sector. And that's why something that I try to also put strong in Ukraine, that somehow still, despite all the conflicts, we have to find common ground. And this is the current work of developing these holistic urban recovery programs in different places in Ukraine. Some of them received dramatic destruction, some of them didn't, like Chernivtsi, as you know. But there's a discussion of, do we now, as Berlin had in 1957 and in the 80s, does IBA or do some other international planning instruments can they be relevant in Ukraine? And that's still an ongoing discussion, and I can't give you a full answer because there is a series of other intertwining and overlapping concepts, like the integrated urban development concept in Ukrainian cities that has been fostered by the German and Swiss government, and many of the Ukrainian cities receive these documents. But in this sense, I feel that we could experiment with that, but only if we're really acting on the both local level, if we really translate these international activities, adapt it to the ground, and if we really do it in an integrated way. And I feel, and there is many of these provocative and interesting, I'd say, news, and I've been interviewed, some of us, for the New York Times Magazine, and many of us being asked, so how can you work in Ukraine? How can you advise that this war is still ongoing? But I think that's something that supports a collegiality and thinking of the potentially more fitting approach. It's never can be too early. So I would like to thank you for the attention, and I hope I didn't went for too long. And again, happy to discuss now and in the future occasions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. That was very efficient. I mean, overview of the history of the country and the city for decades. Very interesting. And the question that came to my mind, actually, to Nutsa with the last slides from Harris, I wonder what was it in any way a participatory process of making a master plan of Tchaltuba, or was it very professional?
It was very professional, and the law that like about urban planning and this document itself, it doesn't include this component of participatory planning. It's only the public presentations. I mean, there's some part of it, but I wouldn't call it participatory planning. Like, there's public presentation with feedbacks that you get from the residents, and then they can write you letters with questions or requests, and you write them back, or you, like, if they are requesting something or just giving you some ideas, you can turn it into your decisions in the planning process later. So that's only part of
This discussion. Yeah. Okay, and Harris, what when you speak to Ukrainian colleagues or customers, what you say them, which mistake they shouldn't repeat, a mistake from Yugoslavian cities, for example?
For sure, we have to curate, and it's not only the Ukraine, we have to curate the international activities, because what we see now is a different international actors and players, and they bring very valuable input and sometimes funding. They compete in the same Ukrainian cities. So if you look into Lviv, for example, there is a plethora of different international projects, and I know the colleague from City Institute, they have challenges, and they do a great job in trying to coordinate and interlink these different activities that come. Second one, and that's connected to the first one, whatever it's being done, is it the master planning for Kharkiv, etc., it has to be grounded in the local urban planning legislation. It has to not just be an international document, as you saw, design. If it's not really rooted in the local urban planning legislation, it's not legally binding, so it can just become an idea, but nothing really implementable. And third one is really going and including, and even in Germany and Switzerland, we don't have yet this co-creation of city being legally binding as part of architecture and urban planning processes. So as much as we would like it, it's not the case. And it's also not the case in many other Eastern European countries. So we still have to find ways to include different non-profit, academic, and also citizens. And there's different other formats that I didn't show this time from Sarajevo, how we did it. But there's different city labs, there's co-creation workshops, there's many things we can do. And in this sense, also, and fourth and last one, to really try to bridge this gap and conflict between the public, private, and the academic and design players, because if we don't, and this conflict got only worse and worse in Sarajevo to the point that they completely stopped speaking to each other. And in this sense, only the citizens, the city reconstruction suffered. So we have to find this quadruple helix ways of collaboration, even though it's difficult.
Okay, thanks a lot. Comments, questions, maybe questions to Harris? I still have one. I was all the time, I was puzzled and thinking which urban morphology was chosen. I mean, from the history, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, socialist, post-socialist, what was chosen for restoration of destroyed parts of the city?
Because you had, of course, the Turkish Development Agency, TİKA, investing highly in the recovery, reconstruction of the heritage from the Ottoman Empire. You have the Austrian government funding almost completely, the reconstruction of the city hall. That's from the early 20th century during Austro-Hungarian period. So you have these sort of traditional, I'd say, historic players coming back and trying to reaffirm, and this is in a way legitimate. So that's to reaffirm their influence in the region. And you have these kind of new players that came, the US American investors who built big shopping malls, etc. So in this sense, and mostly I call it now politically correct interpolation inside, especially the socialist urban fabric, because the social urban fabric really, because of its abundance of green space, offered space and for construction of these new, especially commercial buildings. And this was quite tragic also for the local, for the air pollution, for the recreation spaces, etc. That parks and green spaces have been over constructed with buildings in the 2000s and 2010s, and that's something that also provoked a large citizens protests. In 2014 was as a very dramatic one. So in this sense, this was also for me a wake-up call back then to get also a bit more active in my former hometown and see how we can do it differently. But then it's just to finish my thought. Then you enter this realm, being a mix of a PhD student, activist, urbanist, citizen, etc. And then you have all these different sort of roles. And I decided for myself to still keep these different hats on and try to make it, because I didn't see myself as writing a PhD dissertation in a library in Zurich, and how can this really reach the ground? So in this sense, I also encourage, if I may, also some of younger colleagues, so they're not to get discouraged to give away the designer, the activist, the citizens hat only if you're in academia. I think it wasn't easy, but it's really valuable to keep these different perspectives and try to ground anything you do in the reality.
Yeah. No questions?
Actually, very interested. Could you give an example of this, your planning for or how Ukrainian cities are going to look like? Because for me, it can be an interesting speculation, but you don't know if this territory is going to be occupied. And if the force that occupies it has its own idea of how it's going to be. And rebuilding of Germany was Marshall Plan, basically, for the most part, and then the influence of the Soviet Union after the 50s. So, and you already in the story of rebuilding Sarajevo mentioned that the power of investor is pervading in how it is going to look. So, when you now plan what is going to be in Ukraine, could you just give us a sample of how such planning, like how could it go? What do you consider?
I figure mostly as an advisor, to be honest, as in Ukraine, and because I really believe the Ukrainian colleagues know their cities, their context much better. And we can maybe bring some impulses, but I rather be more in a passive role. There's a couple of other international colleagues who are in a way more active role. And then this also created some dissonances within the Ukrainian colleagues. And, I'm being asked these questions many times. So there is still now, if you look in Sarajevo, the news on Saturday, you would really feel the war is going to be starting again tomorrow. So we're going to be living in this heated, contested, geopolitically, I'd say, contested cities in this buffer zone. And this, I'd say, just what I mentioned by Sarajevo has been in between or eternal temporality, basically since 1476, since the Roman Empire, I think, got divided. So in this sense, waiting for the perfect moment in the Balkans, it's a complete, I think, obsolete thought, because it's never going to come. And and for Ukraine, of course, nobody knows how when and how the war is going to end. Hopefully soon, but we still have to work, to rebuild, to talk, to prepare, to discuss. And of course, it's different to work in Donbass and to work in Chernivtsi. It's a climatically, culturally, from a security point of view, a complete different context. And that's what many colleagues in Western Europe who got very interested into Ukraine suddenly in 22 to work there, they misunderstand, and I would say they very often also underestimate how big and how complex the country of Ukraine is. But I feel, looking into what's happening now, the pressure that the architects receive from different parts of the public and private sector, we now have to bring alternative logics, alternative planning instruments now, so to prepare what's going to happen after. So being inactive now, for me, it's not a option, and advising and answering questions when I'm being asked, I'm going to continue doing so. And I think that's something that we should not stop, but even increase, because again, we don't know how the situation is going to be in 5 and 10 and 30 years. but it should not be paralyzing us.
I think you also mentioned in the presentation there were pictures of some plan, like documents advising the Chernivtsi,
Yeah.
for example. So I think are they accessible online? Is it
Some of
possible?
them are, for example, there's a lot of city partnerships. Chernivtsi has a partnership with Mannheim, a city for which we developed the urban climate adaptation plan. So sometimes there is partner cities. Freiburg has a partnership with Lviv. So there's these interesting friendships and partnerships that we can use, because I believe these cities understand themselves much better than, again, I have to say some really, for me, questionable opportunism of interest of Ukraine by also some of different architects colleagues, and I'm very often being called and asked for advice, and I advise for many of them that they should really engage with the Ukrainian context first before imposing Dutch or German planning instruments to Ukrainian cities. That's ridiculous. That's what exactly didn't work in Sarajevo. So in this sense, there is ongoing projects like in Chernivtsi, those public space mobility project go on for years. And I feel what can be most helpful is to really see where are the existing projects, existing partnership friendships, and what can we amplify, reactivate, rather than show up with a completely new idea and vision that's anyways not going to be implemented. And Sarajevo is a perfect place to show what can happen in this internal temporality. And I have to say, Sarajevo, why does the Austro-Hungarian and Turkish Ottoman heritage still exist next to each other, and it was not removed like in Belgrade? Because Bosnia was for 30 years annexed by Austro-Hungary, and it was not clear whether it goes back to the Ottoman Empire or not. And this is one of the reasons why the First World War started in Sarajevo in 1914, because of assassination, because of this unclear situation. You belong to the west or to the east, and it was very. I have an image of warnings not to throw trash in the tram in 1906 in Sarajevo. It's written in Turkish, in Arabic, in Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian, and in German. So all the and in Hebrew, because you had a quarter of Sarajevans being Jewish before the Second World War. So in this sense, you see these different languages because you could never know where you're going to belong tomorrow. So better list them all.
I think it's a very good example case for ending this particular discussion and bringing out of this room some thoughts. And we were told that the quiche is getting cold downstairs. So we have to run to get it at all. I mean, no warranty quiche anymore, but if we need some, at least we have to run. And Harris, thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Nutsa and Simon, for these very interesting inputs, thought-provoking, I guess. So we will go and continue thinking, and perhaps we'll address you with more questions online or
Thank you very
here
much.
offline.
Looking forward to that. Looking forward. Guten Appetit and talk soon.
Gleichfalls. Thanks a lot.